Good morning, and thank you for joining us. From the service today, Lent calls us to practice justice, which is a perfect introduction to a report from the Social Justice Committee, of which I am a member. I'm Michael Lynch, also co-author of the history book, and you're probably tired of hearing from me already. Other members of the Social Justice Committee are here today, Martha and Charlotte. John Canning is zooming in on camera. I want to do two things this morning, and this will be relatively brief. We want to give a report out on some recent activities of the committee and also offer what's the word? We want to invite, invitation. That's it, sorry. Offer an invitation. So, the report out. The Social Justice Committee actually started when one member of the congregation raised a question about, shouldn't the church have a land acknowledgement statement that recognizes the Stockbridge-Munsee community for whom this church was founded over 200 years ago? A small group of people coalesced around that issue and formed the Social Justice Task Force, and because we were so successful, they made us a full-fledged committee of mission and action. The land acknowledgement statement has been adopted. You find it printed on the last page of this morning's bulletin. You'll also find it on a bronze plaque that's been mounted to one of the brick piers on the new universal access ramp facing the parking lot. If you haven't seen it already, it is beautiful, it is bronze, it is permanent. One of the things that the Social Justice Committee did was invite representatives of the Stockbridge-Munsee community to meet with us and to talk about what we need to do as a church moving forward. Because when we first raised the issue of a land acknowledgement statement, they said, well, a statement is nice, but what are you going to do about it? What are your actions? So we invited them here to meet with us. And one of the things that they observed, and I'm going to read this, and I'm uncomfortable reading this, but you'll understand why shortly. There are 6 marble plaques at the front of the church. I'm sure you've noticed them. I suspect you haven't read them, however, because they're not legible from the pews. The top 4 were the first 4, and they were dedicated on November 1st, 1868. And when I read that, I thought, well, that's odd. You know what November 1st is? It's All Saints' Day. And I thought, I didn't think we had saints in the Congregational Church, but that's what they did. The plaque for John Sargent, the first minister for this church, reads in part, "He delighted to preach the gospel to the children of the forest." And the Stockbridge-Munsee representatives took great and visible and immediate and visceral offense to that statement. Now, because I was researching for the book, I also did a lot of research on things like that. And it turns out that the term children of the forest was being promulgated by the religious sector. There was an organization called the American Tract Society, founded in New York City by a bunch of Presbyterian ministers. And in 1830, they published a 16-page pamphlet called Children of the Forest. So it was a term that was circulating within religious circles. We now recognize it as offensive, just as the Stockbridge-Munsee have brought it to our attention. We just sat through a wonderful sermon by Brent about what Jesus meant by children. That's not what was meant by this. I've read the 14-page dedication sermon that was preached by the minister that day, and it is filled with derogatory terms referencing the Native Americans. So he wasn't talking about children the way Jesus was talking about children. The issue of what to do about that plaque in response to what the Stockbridge-Munsee representatives said fit into the larger discussion that society has been having about what do we do with those statues about Christopher Columbus or Confederate generals, do we rip them down? Do we hide them somewhere else? Or do we put up an interpretive plaque that explains what was meant and how we feel about it now? Now, the Social Justice Committee worked on this for 2 years, back and forth, and we talked with members of the congregation. We consulted with members of the Stockbridge-Muncie community. And what we have decided to do and what we have recommended to the church council and what was approved by the church council is to place a small plaque up here on the wall for anyone who wants to know what we think about that plaque, but also to include one of those newfangled QR codes where it will bring you to a place on our church website that will include much more background information, the chapter in the history book on John Sargent so you understand who he really was, and also a link to the history page on the Stockbridge-Muncie website so that you can do a full deep dive into the background to that one plaque. So I'm going to read you what language we have come up with that's been approved by the council. When Reverend Nathan Eggleston dedicated the John Sargent plaque in 1868, the Stockbridge-based Mohegans had been forced to move westward 4 times before settling in their current reservation in Wisconsin. In 1869, President Grant established the peace policy that placed all Western reservations under the control of various religious groups, including the Congregationalists. Sadly, the prevailing belief of those called assimilationists was that the Native Americans needed to be, quote unquote, civilized, which meant forcing them to learn the ways of white society. The phrase children of the forest that we now recognize as offensive is antithetical to the true missionary spirit of John Sargent. So that'll be on a little plaque, no bigger than that, with a QR code. You can go up, read it, and download all the other background information, including the full text of the 1868 dedication, so you can see just how Reverend Eggleston was not recognizing the importance of the Stockbridge-Muncie community to the original founding of this congregation in that dedication. I'll leave it at that. If anybody's interested in having a copy of that to take home so you can read it or put it on your refrigerator with a magnet, we have several copies printed. They're up front, and when I'm done talking and we've finished answering your questions, you can come up and get one. So that's the update on the work of the Social Justice Committee as it relates to the original charge of developing an ongoing relationship with our Stockbridge-Muncie partners. So here's the invitation. This all started because somebody raised their hand and said, could we do a land acknowledgement? And a group of people formed around that social justice issue. It's not the only social justice issue out there. If you read the paper or watch the news or listen to the news or talk to your neighbors, there's lots and lots and lots of them out there. The Social Justice Committee was formally established to assist anyone else in the congregation who has a passion for a social justice issue. It's not the role of the members of the Social Justice Committee to take on additional issues. If somebody's concerned about something, don't give it to Charlotte, Martha, and me and expect us to run off and fix it. Our role is to facilitate anyone else in the congregation that has an issue that they would like to discuss with other like-minded people, bring before the congregation for discussion. If it gets to the point of requiring church council action, bringing it to the full church council. We have a fully established process that's also been adopted by the church council, and there are copies of that. If anyone has a social issue on their mind that they want to bring forward, there's a nice, simple process. but we think it's simple because we've been through it. Our role is to facilitate your involvement in social justice issues. One of the members of the committee will be a mentor, and we will guide whatever group you create or whatever issue you coalesce around, so that you're not left on your own. You don't just read the procedure and say, okay, now let's do step 2. One of us will be available to you as a resource to help you through the process. Are there any questions, or are there any social issues? We brought a whiteboard here so that we could record them. If yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Donna.
Yes, Donna.
Okay. So I have to dial back a little bit, and I hope this isn't too ignorant a question, but what is social justice, and how is it different from environmental justice?
The question is, what is social justice, and how is it, or is it different from environmental justice? I don't know that we answered that question, or we didn't ask ourselves that question, so I will volunteer my answer. I think social justice encompasses all those other justice issues. Environmental justice is one subset of social justice. Yes, David.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. First of all, other than the flag adjustment, have there been other follow-up activities, plans, et cetera, with the Stockbridge Muncie tribe that would be something that we might consider to be a little more active than adjusting our flags?
So the question is, in addition to the land acknowledgement statement and the plaques, is there anything else that we're contemplating or planning? The short answer is yes. There were 3 things identified in the initial proposal to the Church Council for what the Social Justice then Task Force would do. And the third of those was posting interpretive signs on the property. But that's a much larger issue. That one involves the town of Stockbridge because it's signage. And it also involves working closely with the Stockbridge-Muncie representatives so that the text and the language reflects their history and their understanding of the story as they would like to see it told. So, for example, we know from archaeological excavation that there are 15th century remnants archaeologically around the property, proving that the Native Americans were here on this very piece of land long before European settlers arrived. Well, I don't know that the Stockbridge-Muncie want that generally known, because we don't want people with metal detectors going around and digging up the lawn to look for arrowheads and evidence of Native American occupation. So that's history that we know. It could be an interpretive plaque, but we need to have an in-depth conversation with the Stockbridge-Muncie about what part of the story of their occupation of this site are they willing to share. We know from historical references that there are burials somewhere on this property. Again, do we want to say that? How general do we want to be? And how specific can we be without raising issues? So what we're trying to do is engage in an ongoing conversation with representatives of the Stockbridge-Muncie community so that going forward there can be other things that are not just signage, but activities, inviting them here, inviting artists to produce art to exhibit in the JE room, things like that. And anybody who has an interest in pursuing this can make a proposal and become active with the Social Justice Committee. Did you have a specific idea or thought that you wanted to share?
I have a more general observation.
Okay.
With the death of Jesse Jackson this week, there was a lot of stuff on the radio about him and about his approach to his faith, which he described as people putting their bodies on the line. And with respect and great gratitude something that we could do which would be a little more active, and what I mean by active is more in the community. And what I also mean by active is, you know, I'm a retired psychologist. I believe in reflection, believe me. But reflecting and reflecting and reflecting and reflecting while valuable is not active, especially in situations which sometimes are emergencies. There was a podcast which I came across from, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Kurt Bangstead, who is from Wisconsin. He's the proprietor of the Minocqua Brewing Company, and he's a very left-wing capitalist. And he had a podcast which was, the title of it was, "If you want to promote social justice, go to church." And it was a compendium of all the activities that churches in Wisconsin, not Minnesota, but in Wisconsin are doing on the institutional level, the, you know, Lutheran churches at the, you know, the organizational level, what they're supporting, what they're doing, what individual congregations are doing. It's a long list.
Would you send me a link to that podcast, please? What
So
I,
there's stuff that people are doing, there's stuff that could be done.
Yep.
And I'm hoping that and I'm not even sure the social justice is the committee or the place to bring a concern like this. Perhaps it's mission and action more generally, or the council more generally, I don't know. But I just want to put that out there.
well, I would say the answer to that last question is it goes to the Social Justice Committee as sort of the filter for discussing those issues. If you follow through the process, after Social Justice Committee works with the individuals who are interested in that social justice issue, then it goes up the chain through mission and action, and if necessary, to the full congregation or the full church council. What I will say in response to that is, before the COVID pandemic, there was actually a small working group of us dealing with the issue of sanctuary and what could our church, what could our congregation do about sanctuary, not the physical room called a sanctuary, but this larger issue of providing sanctuary for people who feel threatened or who are threatened. We had multiple meetings with Brent. We were beginning to research what other congregations locally were doing to see whether our church could assist and support them, because we don't have room to provide physical sanctuary to a family or something like that. And then COVID hit and it was dropped. But that's an example of an issue that could be brought to the church for actual bodies on the line. Martha, and then Donna.
I was just going to say, Brent had a couple of meetings with people that were interested in looking at the social issues of our time and how we could respond. And I think he is kind of dovetailing, he's maybe a step or two ahead of the actual process that we came up with, but I think that is a way for us to go. There are very active groups in Berkshire County doing things for the immigrant community, which I think we could certainly plug into or bring in for speakers or education. And I think there are people that would be interested in doing hands-on work for that. There are organizations we can volunteer for. So I think there's room for action.
I'll come back to you, Donna, and then in just a second.
I attended one of those meetings, and one of the questions that was asked of us was, do you want to be active or do you want to be introspective? I mean, or you could be both.
Or learning.
Yeah. Are you going to be a study group or do you want to be, and there 100% said we want to be in action. That was the evening group, that we have done plenty of studying and contemplating, and we're like David was saying, that we really need to do something, just to do something with all of our concerns.
Donna?
I'm remembering Jim Antel coming to church and talking with us person who said, if you haven't been arrested, I don't know how many times, then you haven't been, like, you haven't really been doing your job. You know? And that's putting bodies on the line.
Yes.
You know, incarcerating bodies. But bodies, I think when we put our mind on the line, we're putting part of the body, we're putting our body on the line. When we want to collaborate with the Muncie, you know, the Stockbridge Muncie, that's putting ourselves out there and taking a risk, taking a chance to be unpopular, you know, and taking all the risks of everybody hating us, including the people we're trying to get along with. So I think there are levels of action, of taking that action with the Muncie and the statements that were made here was big. It was very big and very brave. I guess the question is then, is the committee going to choose something to work together on similar to that effort? No. Okay, because I'm thinking that, you know, we're all kind of got volunteer opportunities and we're putting our bodies on the line in action. And like the water issue that I'm putting my body on the line 24/7. But seeing action, being involved in action is so gratifying. It's killer. You know, it's really good. I mean,
Go ahead, Martha.
One of our responses could be to do a survey and find out different ways that people could act individually or volunteer, or what can we do as a congregation. One of the, I think fairly simple, but maybe I'm being idealistic, suggestions that they had was that you designate a private space in your church building so that if for some reason there were landscapers or whatever that needed to come in, that were being pursued by ICE, if they come into a place that is designated private, then ICE cannot arrest them.
Should not.
Right.
But anyway, there are different, that's what a group that gets together that wants to do something would come up with ideas and find out what the resources are in the community.
So I promised this would be brief. We're coming up on a half hour, so I want to call the meeting. I'll call you on it in just a second. One of the things that the committee grappled with is there is no shortage of social justice issues. We can't do all of them all at once, all at the same time. The church has limited resources, both financial, in terms of physical space, and in terms of volunteer effort and energy. So what we hope the process will allow us to do is to focus on those things where there's sufficient community interest that a group of people, at least 3, 5 to 7 is ideal, want to work on an issue, bring it to the full congregation, and try and get support for whatever that issue might be. So take a copy of the process home with you, look at it, think about what social justice issues are of concern to you. There'll be 2 kinds of concerns. You care about it, but you want somebody else to do it. And then there's things that you care about and that get you up in the morning that you want to work on. Those are the ones that are the most important for the Social Justice Committee members to work with you on. Now, Rick, closing comment.
Just want to quickly revisit the plaque issue. When I first came to this church around 2010, I was struck by the incongruity of a bunch of monuments to 19th century white men. Well, some of them were 18th century. Clearly, Sargent and Edwards were significant historical figures. You wrote the history, so you know some of these other chaps were not. Right. You know, this church is, the New England Puritanism is the origin of this church. It just seemed incongruous to have a sort of hagiography for these ministers in the front of our sanctuary. So I just want to say, whenever we remodel the church and paint it, I would suggest we just take the plaques down and get back to our, you know, nice, clean, the congregational meeting house. They did this at my son's church, big Episcopal church in Alexandria, Virginia. You probably read about it in the paper. They had a plaque for George Washington, who had a few there, and for Robert E. Lee, who had a few there. Of course, they were both slaveholders. And they took them down and put them in. They 70 congregants, but they got an equal number who were attracted by the justice of it.
Right.
So, I just, it's just, the plaques bother me. I don't know if they bother anybody else.
Yes, they do. And I'll close with this. The Social Justice Committee, working on the Sargent plaque, had a much larger discussion about the plaques in general, but felt it was beyond the remit for dealing with the language in the John Sargent plaque. But I can tell you from discussions with congregant members, there is a lot of concern about the 6 plaques in front,
I
and
just wanted to give voice to that.
thank you. Anybody want to make a closing comment, or we can?
Thank you for all your hard work.
It's a committee effort. We all worked hard. We were all passionate about this, and I remain so. And thank you for your attention.